To this day, the most infamous hunt of all ravaged a small religious community in colonial Massachusetts.
Salem was a community that was already riven with hostility to one's neighbors.
The horrors begin when children in the minister's house have violent fits, an affliction that seems to be caused by the devil, triggering a savage, unstoppable panic that saw hundreds accused of witchcraft by their neighbors, friends, and family.
This great network of witches all working together across the area.
They know at the end of this that they could be judged guilty of witchcraft and they'll be hanged.
Once you've crossed that line of actually executing someone, it's very difficult to stop.
It could never go back to the way it was. This was a war zone.
This is the story of the Salem witch trials.
Salem is a Puritan community.
The Puritans were a dissenting branch of the Anglican Church who fled England in the early 1600s.
They were concerned that living in England, the hierarchy of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was telling them what to do, was making them believe things that they didn't actually want to believe. So off they go to America to found their own church and to own their own doctrine.
As the Puritan population increased over the coming decades, they established multiple colonies in what would become the northeast of the United States. Really the locus of Puritan influence and the locus of the Congregational Church was in Massachusetts, was in places like Boston and Salem.
The community at Salem is a Congregationalist community, which means that the people there have a belief that the congregation itself should be able to shape how the church works.
Puritans in Salem Village have the power to elect a new minister to lead their congregation. They nominate the recently ordained Samuel Parris.
Samuel Parris arrived in Salem Village in 1689.
He's come to Salem from Barbados. He has had a bit of a career as a merchant before then. He's not actually very successful. He comes to New England to try his luck at something new, at something different in this new colony that's just sort of building itself up in the 17th century.
He sails first to Boston, where he lives for a couple of years with his family, and then to Salem Village.
Salem Village is a kind of an appendage to Salem Town. Salem Town is the much more prosperous community.
Salem Village was fractious. This was not considered a destination for an ambitious minister like Paris.
He enters into the community and he starts sifting out the most godly people around him to join his sort of special congregation of particularly pious villagers.
I think he's quite an embittered individual, and I think he tends to take that frustration out through very, very sort of impassioned preaching.
Because he's a new minister, he's very keen to prove his place in the village and his utility to the local community.
Paris has overseen the church in Salem for 2 difficult years. When this highly religious community is thrown into disarray, young girls in nearby villages have been experimenting with magic.
They had been doing something known as the egg and glass. The idea was that you would take an egg and you would then drip the white of the egg into a bowl of water and look at the shapes it makes. You were asking God to give you some insight into what shape your future would take.
What starts off as playing around with fortune telling becomes more sinister. What they saw in the water was the shape of a coffin. They start feeling very worried.
This kind of divination was regarded as demonic.
It's impossible to know if Samuel Paris's daughter Betty and niece Abigail took part in these rituals, but something terrible happens shortly afterwards.
Betty Paris starts showing strange symptoms of affliction. This then spreads to Abigail.
They start saying that their muscles hurt and they start screaming. You can imagine how distressing that would have been for their family.
This upheaval is coming from right inside the house of the minister.
Reverend Samuel Paris calls in the doctor. He says, "It is supernatural. I can't cure it, so it must be witchcraft."
The people of Salem, they're very religious. They believe in God, but that means they believe in the devil too. They're kind of on the lookout for witchcraft.
There had certainly been plenty of cases in Europe involving what was known as bewitchment. What was happening to Betty and Abigail seemed to follow this recognised model. There was an established precedent for blaming this on witches.
When the community has decided to accept the idea that these girls are being attacked by witches, the next stage in the process is then saying, who is it who is doing this to you? Who is afflicting you?
The names that come up are 2 women of middling age who were unpopular within their community. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. The other name we have is Tituba. Tituba was a servant in the house of Samuel Paris.
I think her name was probably originally something like Tatabay. She comes from a grouping on the South American mainland called the Tatabetana.
There was that ethnic difference compared to the people surrounding her.
And it's kind of that classic idea of assuming that people who are different are more likely to be in league with things that are deemed evil and unfamiliar to you.
Abigail and Betty might have picked on Tituba as well, because Betty's father Samuel may have been critical of a woman of colour who lived in his community. I can imagine him bullying Tituba. I can imagine him speaking critically about her, maybe thinking she wasn't a good enough Christian. So it's really no surprise to Samuel when Abigail and Betty start pointing the finger at Tituba and saying that she's a witch. The affliction starts spreading from Abigail and Betty to their friends, the Putnam family. They start exhibiting the same symptoms. They start screaming in the night. They start convulsing. they start pointing the finger and saying that they too are bewitched by the people that Abigail and Betty have suspected.
First of March, 1692. The accused are dragged in front of magistrates. A confession is needed before they're sent to trial. For all the women, it's a terrifying ordeal. Especially Tituba, the woman of indigenous or African heritage.
Tituba begins by denying that she did anything at all.
She's in front of these powerful white men. She's probably been hurt, and she's certainly been enslaved by powerful white men. This is a very bullying power relationship that she's in this room.
These women were looking for ways to try and save themselves. Therefore, they might come to say the things that people wanted to hear, confess to imaginary crimes.
In the end, during her questioning, Tituba starts to say, "I did hurt the children." She said, "The devil came to me, and the devil came to me, you must hurt the children, you must hurt the children." He threatened me, she said. He said he would kill me, he would tear me to pieces, he would cut my head off.
With Tituba's confession secured, the magistrates also questioned the other two women accused of being witches, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne.
As part of this questioning, Sarah Good's young daughter Dorothy was asked about whether her mother was in fact a witch. She was only 4, what was she expected to say? And of course she said, yes, my mother is a witch, and she admits witchcraft herself, which is particularly shocking. The people of Salem send the suspects off to Boston, the capital of the colony of Massachusetts, to await trial. They're kept in chains. There are women, there are some children like Dorothy Good. There are people who are absolutely desperate.
Although the accused women have been jailed, it will be many months until a trial can proceed.
The colony of Massachusetts, it's governed under a charter from the British government, and the charter has expired. The governor and many of the leading men of the colony have gone off to England to secure a new charter to make sure that its legal processes can continue to function.
Although the Salem town magistrates can question suspects, they can't really start any trials until the governor arrives from England. It gives more space and time for the afflictions to spread and the concern of the community to grow.
During that time, questions keep on being asked. A lot of other names start getting mentioned. And these women who are sitting around in these jail cells happen to keep remembering other people who might have been involved. Things start to spiral.
It's Black Friday all month at Auto Fair Subaru of Haverhill. During our huge Black Friday triple play, choose from Solterra, Forester, Outback, or Crosstrek. Lease for just $1.99.
Months pass. The people of Salem Village grow ever more convinced that witches walk amongst them.
Further accusations are coming from the supposedly afflicted girls.
Samuel Powys is preaching about witchcraft to the congregation, and the contagion seems to be continuing. There are stories of more girls getting afflicted.
The suspects also carry on being questioned, and they carry on telling stories about the witchcraft that they supposedly committed. They name new suspects back in Salem Village, people like Bridget Bishop, and then these people are brought in for questioning too.
Most news is spread by word of mouth. People communicating at the marketplace, when they were trading.
About 75% of those who are accused are female. And that's because women are seen as particularly prone to becoming witches. They're seen as gateways of the devil. They're seen as people who might fall prey to these sort of demonic lies. Samuel Parris also asked the previous minister of Salem, Deodat Lawson, to come and visit and see what he thinks of the situation.
And then he goes to the Parris household and he sees Betty Parris in one of her fits.
She's running around the room screaming. She's trying to climb out of the window and fly.
And he writes an account of what he saw and what he experienced while he was in Salem Village.
As a minister and trusted member of society, Lawson's vivid account adds credibility to the witch hunt.
The first accused witches were the outsiders. They were those you might consider the usual suspects of witchcraft. But as the accusations grow, more and more prominent people are actually drawn into this net.
The sorts of people who would not expect to be giving themselves up to the devil.
They're not people who might be seen as outsiders or scapegoats, like the Native American Tituba or the homeless person Sarah Good. These are prime, upstanding members of Samuel Parris's congregation. People like Rebecca Nurse, who has been a member of the church all her life and is seen by her neighbours as being a pious and good person.
She's a pillar of the godly community. You would expect her to be protected from accusation.
But nevertheless, she's named as a witch. As the accusations spread, they dig deeper and deeper into Salem's community.
We have to begin from the important fact that everybody believed in the existence of witches. And so as these rumors begin spreading, there's a sense of crisis. There's a sense that Satan is actually successfully waging this war on their community.
Salem was a community that was already riven with division.
You've got the tension between Salem Village and Salem Town. Salem Village is more backward looking, much poorer than Salem Town.
Salem Town is wealthier, it's fancier, it's becoming more interested in the refinements of society, the kind of things that Puritans disapprove of very strongly indeed.
And then you've got Parris. Rather than smoothing things over and calming things down, he really intensifies the factions and the resentments. And I think the fact that the afflictions of the children start in his household suggests that he very much is at the centre of a lot of this concern.
Within Salem Village, there is a division between two of the prominent families, and those are the Putnams and the Porters.
The Porter household and their allies were much more politically linked to Salem Town, whereas the Putnams are inward-looking, much more linked to Parris as the Salem Village minister, much more older-fashioned in their emphasis on Puritan godliness. The accused witches tended to come from the Porter network, whereas the afflicted tended to be much more closely linked to the Parris-Putnam faction.
The villagers are turning on each other, but beyond the village there are even worse threats. There are Native American peoples who the villagers have taken their land, essentially, and they've dispossessed them. There's also famine because they don't know which kind of crops to grow. The Native Americans aren't helping them anymore, naturally enough. There's disease. There are wars to the north, in Maine. And some of the people who are doing the accusing in Salem Village are probably refugees from the war. We're dealing with people who are really traumatized.
All of these factors are then feeding into the division at Salem and perpetuating this mood of suspicion, potentially of hostility to one's neighbours. Between January and May, we end up with 81 people accused of witchcraft, 49 of whom are imprisoned.
This is developing into a massive social, cultural, political crisis.
Several months after the first accusations, Governor Phipps arrives with the new Massachusetts Charter in hand. He now has the power to open the courts, and the accused will either find justice and freedom or a brutal death.
When the governor arrives back from England with the new charter, he has a range of pressing matters to deal with. There are Native American wars going on to the north. There are wars between the English and the French, and he has to go in person to intervene. So he's not present in the colony of Massachusetts for quite some time after his arrival. However, he's briefed about the people awaiting trial for witchcraft in Boston jail, and on May the 27th, he sets up a special court to deal with them, a court of oyer and termina, which means to hear and determine.
Which is basically an old English method for dealing with a legal emergency. It was used in the Middle Ages for things like popular rebellion, when you've suddenly got a really unusual number of trials that you need to get through.
The trials are held in the meeting house, so essentially the community's own church. It's a packed room, it's a hot room, it's a noisy room, it's crowded. It must have felt incredibly intimidating.
This is a spectacle that a lot of villagers, some of whom don't think so highly of the accused, are coming to watch.
Governor Phipps won't lead the court himself, he won't be the judge. He asks his friends, the intellectuals, the important men in the community to help him.
There's also a lot of potential for the judge to steer things in the way that he wants.
As the court assembles in Salem town, the accused witches are led from jail, desperately hoping they will find mercy.
The accused people have to defend themselves. They don't have lawyers.
They would have been reliant on their own words, their own denials. You get this very, very dramatic, peculiar situation where the afflicted girls, including Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, are brought into the courtroom in a group.
They might writhe or whimper or babble.
They actually throw fits in front of the court. They make new accusations. They say things like, she's attacking me, she's screaming at me, she's hitting me.
If the accused witch in the dock raises an arm, the afflicted individuals would react to that. It's quite hard for us to imagine how sensational that would have been and how much their performance kind of convinces people that they're being attacked by witches.
The suspects must have been frightened. They must have been terribly upset by this public humiliation. It must have been an awful, traumatic experience for them. They know at the end of this that they could be judged guilty of witchcraft and that they'll be hanged.
Your options when it came to defending yourself against a witchcraft charge were pretty limited. But there was an idea that those who confessed to the crime had at least shown some kind of repentance, some kind of remorse.
If you confessed, you lost your reputation. Not only had you told a lie before God, but all your neighbours would then judge you to be a witch. You'd be permanently tainted. But also the people who confess will be spared. They will be judged guilty, but they won't be executed. And of course, it's a massive inducement to confess. The judges don't seem to have spotted that one, but it's something that really makes the trials catch fire.
Tituba, the first person accused of witchcraft by the Parris family, finally takes the stand.
Tituba did admit that she was a witch, whether she believed herself to be one or not.
When she introduced this idea that there might be this great network of witches all working together across the area.
And she she was spared, therefore. She was not to be executed, she was returned to jail. Of course, that was a punishment in itself, but it did save her life.
Those who confessed to the crime might well have helped out the authorities by giving details about what happened, naming other names.
As one person after another confesses and is spared, the number of witchcraft suspects and convicted witches starts to grow again. As well as sparing confessing suspects, the court also makes another fatal decision, which is to admit what's called spectral evidence. And this is essentially evidence based on the visions of the accusers.
Spectral evidence draws on this idea that the devil has the power to cause hallucinations in people's minds.
Spectral evidence was basically evidence that wasn't visible to most of the townspeople, but was in fact visible to the accusers. Sometimes these spirits admitted their culpability to earlier crimes. Sometimes other spirits accused the supposed witch of a particular crime.
This now is an absolute nightmare when it comes to evidential standards, because what you have here is a form of evidence that is basically impossible to disprove. So spectral evidence allows the trials to escalate, allows them to move further into the realm of fantasy and away from anything we would consider valid proof. Other members of the community are essentially allowing this to happen by not protesting loudly against it. There are cases of brave individuals who try to defend their loved ones, but it was potentially a pretty dangerous business.
Trials would have been very, very quick by comparison with today.
It can be as little as 15 minutes to determine whether somebody lives or dies.
On the 2nd of June, the Court of Oyer and Terminer renders their first verdict.
It's Bridget Bishop, and she's sentenced to be hanged.
On the 2nd of June, the court makes its first conviction of Bridget Bishop.
She says not guilty in court, she's condemned to die, but she maintains her innocence to the gallows, and that's quite disturbing for people. Having an execution of someone for witchcraft is dramatic enough, but she's not going to the gallows as a kind of a penitent sinner admitting her guilt. She's actually saying, you guys got it wrong.
The same day, one of the judges actually resigns from the court. So there are already some signs that things aren't going well.
Now an actual execution has happened. Things have got serious. People are getting murdered because of these accusations.
On the 29th of June, one of the original suspects, Sarah Good, is arraigned and formally charged. And she's charged alongside 4 other women. Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilde. At that trial, all 5 of the women are found guilty and they're sentenced to death. The 5 women are executed on the 19th of July. Sarah Good turns on the crowd and the ministers and the judges, and she says to them, I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard, because she is an innocent woman about to be hanged. God will give you blood to drink. And that sounds very much like a curse, but at the same time it also feels like a bit of a prophecy that this is all going to come to a very bad end indeed.
There's also growing doubt over what's going on now that it's proving just so serious.
A number of ministers are asked for their opinion of the trials, and in particular, the way that spectral evidence is being used. Some people are concerned that the accused people might actually be making up evidence of seeing the spectres of the accused witches. And they want people like Cotton Mather, who is a university intellectual and somebody with wide experience in the field of judging the demonic.
Cotton Mather was regarded as one of the foremost authorities on witches. He wrote widely on the subject, and he wrote widely from a position of real authority as being one of the senior ministers in Massachusetts at the time.
So Cotton Mather and a number of other ministers write a letter to the court in which they sum up their opinion on this type of evidence. It is, however, a very equivocal letter. They say on the one hand that there are some doubts about this kind of evidence and that exquisite caution, as they put it, should be used in judging the accused people. But at the same time they give the court a pat on the head and they say, well, you should just continue doing what you're doing. Because of course the ministers do believe that there are witches in the Salem community.
Very important that a group of men, of Puritan ministers with such influence in the colony, say, be careful. But then they're also saying, but it's a jolly good thing to hunt witches. So it's a very, very difficult situation for the authorities.
Meanwhile, some people are asking questions about why the accusers are making the accusations that they are. Perhaps things have got out of hand and gone too far.
That's part of this beginning of perhaps doubt about the validity of the testimony and the validity of the spectral evidence.
Yet even though there are doubts about the process of the convictions, on August the 19th, a further 5 people are hanged. And one of them is even a former minister, George Burroughs. He's Samuel Parris's predecessor. Burroughs is being accused partly because he's drifted from the position that Samuel Parris feels the church should be occupying.
George gives supposedly this quite impassioned speech where he talks about what's happened, closes it with a perfect recitation of the Lord's Prayer. This was an old stereotype about witches, that they couldn't get through the Lord's Prayer without at some point tripping up. George recites it perfectly, and this also may have generated some doubts in the minds of the onlookers.
The crowd start to murmur and they move towards almost a riot. And they say the execution should be stopped. But who should come along but Cotton Mather, who has come to the executions to watch justice being done. He gives almost a sermon to the crowd, in which he says that these people are indeed witches and that there's nothing wrong here, the execution should continue. And of course, because he's a minister, he's a powerful, important figure in the community, the crowd accept his authority. The executions proceed and the 5 people are killed. The bodies aren't even buried properly. They're thrown into a nearby crevice in the rock and partially covered by earth.
As doubts about the witch trials grow, some villagers courageously decide to take a stand, but the repercussions of their actions will prove deadly.
Get clearance prices all month at Auto Fair Honda during our huge Black Friday triple play. Drive home a brand new Honda CR-V for just $295 per.
On the the 18th of September 1692, one of the witchcraft suspects, Giles Corey, refuses plead at his trial.
And the courts at this time had a slightly strange idea that if people refused to enter a plea, you could subject them to torments to compel them to do so. And this is what happens to Giles Corey.
It's an act of defiance to not submit a plea and allow yourself to be subjected to torture. And it may be that he would have imagined that he was going to be found guilty either way, that the outcome was inevitable and that he had no control over it.
The 18th to the 19th of September 1692, he has heavy weights piled on top of him.
That would have been like a suffocation. It's like a slow death.
When they ask him, what do you want to say to the court? He says, more weight.
He had nothing to lose. He's going to die anyway. But he can die with his own dignity and he can die with his own sense of innocence.
But one effect of him dying without entering a plea is that his estate remained his own property and passed to his descendants, to his son-in-laws. If he had died having been convicted of witchcraft, his estate would become the property of the authorities.
Without a plea, trial, or conviction, the execution of Giles Corey is unlawful. His death sends shockwaves through the community. Days later, his wife, Martha Corey, is also executed, sent to the gallows, guilty of witchcraft.
It's an absolute disaster for the community of Massachusetts, and it will leave a terrible legacy.
It's been 7 months now. We've had 185 people accused. 59 have gone to trial, 19 were hanged, others died in prison. This then takes on a life of its own, spreads geographically.
Across communities like Beverly, Malden, Gloucester, Andover, Ipswich, Marblehead, Charlestown, and Boston itself, people are being accused of witchcraft.
The witch hunts spread across New England. They continued to attract the attention of religious experts, including a clergyman and scholar from Boston, Increase Mather, whose son, Cotton Mather, is already deeply involved with the trials in Salem Village.
Increase Mather writes a letter to express some of his doubts, to say that maybe some of the evidence, maybe some of the accusations don't carry the water that we once thought they did. After all, the spectral evidence is a pretty slim reed to hang people on.
Increase really begins to call on the Governor Phipps to come and sort stuff out.
Phipps and Increase Mather go back a long way. They came together on the ship from England with the new charter. William Phipps really respects Increase Mather, and what he sees in Increase's letter really concerns him. There's also a rumour going around the colony that somebody has named Mary Phipps, Governor's wife, as a witch.
And it would make sense, from Satan's perspective, not to limit himself to the older, less affluent women that were so often associated with witchcraft. If Satan really meant business, he would go after the elites among them.
So there are a couple of powerful motives for William Phipps to want to put an end to the witch trials. It's a huge crisis and he needs to do something immediately.
Governor Phipps decides that public opinion has shifted enough to call a stop to these proceedings.
Governor Phipps dismantles the courts responsible for the brutal witch trials. The remaining accused are safe from execution.
The people still in jail are released.
Tituba was kept in prison for at least a year. There's a statement from the jailer where he says that he hasn't been paid. And we know that somebody paid that bill, which leads us to think that maybe, in the end, Tituba was freed.
Samuel Parris's role in the witch trials had created such bad blood within the village.
Parris, by that point, is very embittered. He feels that he's failed as a minister.
The family members of some of the executed actually successfully pushed him out of the village and out of his ministry.
So what's left at Salem? Not very much. A dislocated community where neighbours are not speaking to each other. The whole church structure has fallen apart.
The economic impact of that would have been very significant. The pendulum of support swings towards the families of the accused. It becomes an episode the whole community really wants to forget about.
There is a legacy of guilt and unease over the whole affair.
It could never go back to the way it was.
In January 1697, the General Court orders a day of prayer and fasting to reflect back on the history of the witch trials. Then, another of the judges publishes a public apology for his role in the trials.
In 1752, Salem Village rebrands itself. It calls itself Danvers. It's caused a lot of division, a lot of friction.
And then, in the 20th century, it's revisited.
In 1957, the state of Massachusetts apologised for the witch trials. That happened partly because of a play, The Crucible. And that play is really the reason why the Salem witch trials are so famous today. But historians have been trying ever since to explain these terrible events. This started with two young girls being sick at the house of a minister. People have wondered whether the girls were psychotic. Were they lying? Did they make the whole thing up?
A lot of the blame is placed on the girls who made the original accusations. But that exonerates the men who led the trials, who rendered the